Betty's hands trembled as she held her phone toward me, her coffee growing cold on my kitchen table. The terror in her eyes made my blood freeze. "Frank," she whispered, "you need to see what your grandson is really doing." What I saw on that screen shattered everything I thought I knew about my family. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning had started like any other Tuesday in Millbrook. October leaves scattered across my front yard like nature's confetti, and the familiar smell of autumn hung in the crisp Ohio air. At 72, I'd grown to appreciate these quiet mornings more than I ever expected. 2 years since Helen passed, and I was finally learning to find peace in solitude rather than drowning in memories. My garage workshop had become my sanctuary. 47 years of fixing engines and solving mechanical puzzles had given me steady hands and a methodical mind, qualities that served me well in retirement. The old Buick I was restoring sat waiting under its tarp, a project that connected me to better days when Kevin would spend summers learning the difference between a socket wrench and a box wrench. Those summers felt like decades ago now. Kevin had been 12 when he first showed real interest in mechanical work, his small fingers surprisingly nimble with delicate parts. Helen would bring us sandwiches and lemonade while we worked, her laughter filling the garage when Kevin inevitably emerged covered in grease from head to toe. She'd shake her head and say he was turning into a smaller version of me, stubborn and determined to understand how everything functioned. The falling out still stung when I let myself think about it. Kevin had been accepted to Columbus State Community College for their automotive technology program, a natural fit for his talents and interests. Helen and I had been so proud, believing he'd follow in my footsteps, but with modern training I never had access to. Then everything changed during his second semester. He'd called one evening, his voice carrying a nervous energy I'd never heard before. "Grandpa, I'm switching majors. Computer information systems. There's more money in technology than fixing cars." The disappointment had hit me like a punch to the gut. Generations of Thompson men had worked with their hands, built things, repaired what was broken. Kevin was throwing away a scholarship and natural ability for something that seemed abstract and impersonal. The argument that followed had been our worst. Kevin accused me of being stuck in the past, unable to understand that the world was changing. I'd responded with harsh words about responsibility and following through on commitments. Helen had tried to mediate, but the damage was done. Kevin stopped coming around for Sunday dinners, stopped calling except for holidays, and eventually moved to Columbus after landing some technical support job. Helen's death 2 years ago had deepened the rift. Kevin attended the funeral, of course, but he seemed like a stranger in his ill-fitting suit, standing apart from the community that had helped raise him. We'd exchanged maybe 50 words that day, polite condolences that felt hollow and formal. Since then, our contact had dwindled to brief phone calls on my birthday and Christmas, conversations that felt obligatory rather than genuine. This morning had started like any other Tuesday in Millbrook. October leaves scattered across my front yard like nature's confetti, and the familiar smell of autumn hung in the crisp Ohio air. At 72, I'd grown to appreciate these quiet mornings more than I ever expected. 2 years since Helen passed, and I was finally learning to find peace in solitude rather than drowning in memories. My garage workshop had become my sanctuary.
We'd developed a neighborly friendship based on mutual respect and shared appreciation for privacy. She borrowed my hedge trimmer occasionally, I helped her with minor home repairs, and we both understood the value of minding our own business while remaining available for emergencies. Her frantic knocking at 8:30 had been completely out of character. Betty was methodical, organized, the type of person who planned conversations in advance and rarely made impulsive visits. When I opened the door, her face was pale and her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold her phone steady. "Frank, I need to show you something," she'd said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's about Kevin. You need to see this right now." The urgency in her tone had sent alarm bells through my system. Betty wasn't prone to drama or exaggeration. If she said something was important, it was important. I'd invited her into the kitchen, poured coffee from the pot I'd made earlier, and waited for her to compose herself enough to explain what had shaken her so thoroughly. She'd sat across from me at Helen's old kitchen table, the same table where Kevin had eaten countless breakfasts during those summer visits. Her coffee remained untouched as she fumbled with her phone, scrolling through what appeared to be social media posts or news articles. The device seemed foreign in her trembling hands, despite her job requiring daily computer use. "I found this on a neighborhood watch group," she finally managed. "Someone posted it asking if anyone recognized the people involved. Frank, I think Kevin might be in serious trouble." The screen she turned toward me showed a grainy security video, the kind of footage that made everything look slightly distorted and unreal. At first, I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. The timestamp showed it was recorded 3 days ago, late at night in what appeared to be an apartment complex parking garage. 2 figures moved across the frame, their actions deliberate and coordinated in a way that immediately struck me as wrong. The taller figure was dragging something heavy, while the shorter one kept watch near a stairwell entrance. The image quality made facial recognition difficult, but something about the taller person's build and movement pattern seemed familiar in a way that made my stomach clench. When the figure turned slightly toward the camera, adjusting whatever burden he was carrying, I caught a glimpse of profile that stopped my breathing entirely. The facial features, the way he moved his shoulders when lifting something heavy, the particular gait I'd watched develop over years of following him around the garage. Details that might mean nothing to a stranger, but spoke volumes to someone who'd watched this person grow up. The realization hit me like ice water in my veins. Betty's voice seemed to come from underwater. "The person who posted this said they heard arguing from one of the apartments earlier that night. Then they saw this on their security footage. Frank, they think someone might have been hurt." I stared at the screen, willing my eyes to be wrong, desperate to find some detail that would prove this couldn't be Kevin. But the more I studied the video, the more convinced I became. The height was right, the build matched, even his habitual way of checking over his shoulder before doing something he shouldn't do. A gesture I'd seen countless times when he was young and trying to hide broken tools or spilled paint. The shorter figure remained largely obscured, but appeared to be directing the operation with urgent hand signals. Their coordination suggested this wasn't improvised, but planned, practiced, executed with the efficiency of people who'd done similar work before. That realization made everything worse, because it implied this wasn't an isolated incident or moment of panic, but part of a pattern. Betty leaned forward, her voice dropping even lower. "There's more, Frank. I kept looking after I found this video. Your grandson has been posting pictures of expensive things lately. Designer clothes, fancy restaurants, a new car. Way more than someone in technical support should be able to afford." She scrolled through what appeared to be Kevin's social media profiles, showing me images I never would have known existed. Photos of him wearing watches that cost more than my monthly pension, dining at restaurants where individual meals exceeded my weekly grocery budget. Pictures with a young woman who looked equally expensive, both of them smiling in locations that screamed wealth and privilege. The woman had to be Rachel Martinez, the girlfriend Kevin had mentioned during our last awkward phone conversation. He'd been vague about how they'd met and what she did for work, details that had seemed unimportant at the time. Now those omissions felt ominous, like pieces of a puzzle I should have been paying closer attention to assembling. This lifestyle made no sense with what I knew about Kevin's employment situation. Technical support jobs in Columbus paid decent wages, but nothing that would fund this kind of extravagance. Either Kevin had found a dramatically better position he hadn't mentioned, or the money was coming from sources he couldn't discuss openly. The security video played again automatically, the endless loop making the scene more disturbing with each repetition. I found myself analyzing every detail, searching for some explanation that would make this acceptable or at least understandable.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Maybe they were helping someone move furniture late at night. Maybe the arguing Betty had mentioned was unrelated to what the camera captured. Maybe this was all coincidence and paranoia. But 47 years of troubleshooting mechanical problems had taught me that when multiple systems failed simultaneously, the cause was rarely coincidental. When Kevin's lifestyle exceeded his known income, when security footage showed him engaged in suspicious nighttime activities, when neighbors reported arguments followed by mysterious movements, the pattern pointed toward conclusions I didn't want to accept. Betty's presence across from me anchored the moment in reality. This wasn't a nightmare I could wake up from or a misunderstanding I could resolve with a simple phone call. The evidence sat on her phone screen, digital and permanent, recorded by security systems that didn't lie or exaggerate for dramatic effect. My grandson, the boy I'd taught to change oil and replace brake pads, the child who'd cried when we had to put down our old dog Rex, was apparently involved in something that required disposing of evidence in parking garage shadows. The transformation from innocent child to whatever he'd become felt impossible to process, like trying to understand how a perfectly tuned engine could suddenly seize without warning. Betty closed her phone and slid it across the table toward me, her face grave with the weight of shared knowledge. "Frank, I think we need to call someone about this. The police? Maybe social services? This isn't something we can just ignore and hope goes away." Her words echoed in the suddenly quiet kitchen, while my mind raced through possibilities I'd never wanted to consider. The security footage had planted seeds of doubt that were already growing into full-blown terror. Kevin involved in something criminal? Kevin disposing of evidence in parking garages? Kevin living beyond his means through methods that required secrecy and shadow work? I picked up Betty's phone again and watched the video loop through another cycle. The figures moved with practiced efficiency, their actions coordinated like a team that had worked together before. This wasn't amateur hour fumbling through a first-time mistake. This looked professional, calculated, executed with the kind of smooth precision that only came from experience. The timestamp showed 3 in the morning, well past when honest work happened. The lighting was poor, creating long shadows that obscured details, but the intent was unmistakable.
Something heavy was being moved from one location to another under cover of darkness, and both participants understood the importance of avoiding detection. Betty leaned forward, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I've been watching that apartment complex since I found this video. It's where Kevin lives now, isn't it? The Riverside Gardens development off Route 33. I drove by there yesterday morning and there were police cars in the parking lot." My stomach dropped toward my shoes. Police presence at Kevin's residence couldn't be coincidence, not when combined with security footage showing suspicious nighttime activities. The timeline was too convenient, the connections too obvious to dismiss as unrelated incidents. Police cars could mean anything, I told myself, grasping for explanations that didn't involve Kevin being arrested or investigated. Break-ins happened at apartment complexes, car thefts, domestic disputes between neighbors, routine patrol checks, dozens of reasons that had nothing to do with my grandson disposing of evidence in parking garages. But the rational part of my mind, the part that had spent decades diagnosing engine problems through systematic elimination of variables, wasn't buying the innocent explanations. When multiple symptoms appeared simultaneously, experienced mechanics looked for common causes rather than coincidental failures. Kevin's lifestyle changes, the security footage, police presence at his residence. The pattern pointed toward conclusions I desperately wanted to avoid. Betty stood up and walked to my kitchen window, pulling back the curtain to peer toward the street as if expecting surveillance vehicles to appear at any moment. Her nervous energy was contagious, making my own anxiety spike higher with each passing minute. "There's something else," she said, without turning around. "I called my sister Jenny yesterday. She works dispatch for Columbus Police Department. I asked her about any recent incidents at Riverside Gardens, trying to sound casual, like I was just curious about neighborhood safety. My pulse quickened. Betty had been investigating Kevin's situation more thoroughly than she'd initially let on. Her involvement suggested she believed the security footage represented genuine criminal activity rather than misunderstood innocent behavior. Ginny told me they've been getting calls from that complex over the past month. Noise complaints, reports of arguments from Unit 12B. That's Kevin's apartment number, Frank. The neighbors have been complaining about loud fights coming from his place, usually late at night when people are trying to sleep. Unit 12B. I'd written that address in my phone book months ago when Kevin had called to provide his new contact information. The same apartment where neighbors were reporting regular disturbances, where police had been responding to complaints, where the security footage had captured suspicious activities just days earlier. The connections were forming a picture I didn't want to see. Kevin arguing with someone regularly enough to generate multiple noise complaints. Kevin and his girlfriend engaging in activities that required disposing of evidence after dark. Kevin displaying wealth that exceeded his legitimate income sources. Kevin avoiding family contact beyond minimal holiday obligations. Betty returned to the table and sat down heavily, her face showing the strain of carrying this knowledge alone. I didn't want to worry you unnecessarily, but the more I dug into this situation, the worse it looked. Your grandson is involved in something serious, Frank, something that could destroy his life if it hasn't already. The weight of her words settled over me like a lead blanket. Kevin was 28 years old, supposedly an adult, capable of making his own decisions and living with the consequences. But he was also the little boy I'd taught to ride a bicycle in this same driveway, the teenager who'd helped me rebuild the engine in Helen's old Ford, the young man who'd cried at his grandmother's funeral despite our strained relationship. Family didn't stop being family just because members made terrible choices. Blood relations created obligations that couldn't be severed by disagreements or disappointments.
If Kevin was in trouble, then I had responsibilities as his grandfather, even if he'd pushed me away and built walls between us. But what exactly were those responsibilities? Should I drive to Columbus and confront him directly about the security footage and lifestyle inconsistencies? Should I contact police and provide them with Betty's discoveries? Should I hire a private investigator to gather more information before taking any action? Should I reach out to other family members who might have better relationships with Kevin? The problem was that Helen and I had been Kevin's primary family connections. His parents had died in a car accident when he was 8, leaving him in our care through his teenage years. Helen's sister lived in Florida and barely maintained contact with Ohio relatives. My own siblings had passed away or moved to distant states decades ago. Kevin's social circle consisted mainly of work colleagues and new friends he'd made in Columbus, people I'd never met and couldn't contact. I was essentially the only family member in position to help Kevin if he needed help, or to intervene if he was making dangerous choices. The responsibility felt overwhelming, especially given our recent estrangement and my complete lack of knowledge about his current life circumstances. Betty reached across the table and covered my hand with hers, her touch warm and reassuring, despite the cold fear radiating through my chest. Frank, you need to be careful about how you handle this. If Kevin really is involved in criminal activities, then approaching him directly could put you in danger too. Her warning sent ice through my veins. I hadn't considered the possibility that Kevin might pose a physical threat to family members who discovered his secrets. The boy I remembered was gentle, sensitive, more likely to cry than fight when faced with conflict. But people changed, especially when money and desperation entered the equation. The security footage showed someone comfortable with moving heavy objects under cover of darkness, someone who worked with a partner to accomplish goals that required avoiding detection. That wasn't the Kevin I'd raised, the child who'd been afraid of the dark and needed nightlights until he was 12 years old. Money changed people in ways that destroyed everything they'd once valued. I'd seen it happen to friends and neighbors over the years.
decent folks who got involved with gambling or drugs or get-rich-quick schemes that required cutting corners and ignoring consequences. The transformation was always gradual at first, then sudden and complete once moral boundaries had been crossed enough times to lose their significance. Maybe Kevin's move to Columbus had exposed him to influences that slowly corrupted his values and judgment. Maybe his girlfriend Rachel was connected to criminal networks that had recruited him through promises of easy money and exciting lifestyle upgrades. Maybe his technical skills had made him valuable to organizations that needed computer expertise for illegal activities. The possibilities were endless and uniformly terrifying. Each scenario I imagined involved Kevin sinking deeper into dangerous waters, making choices that would eventually lead to arrest, imprisonment, or worse, consequences that would destroy any possibility of returning to legitimate life. Betty squeezed my hand gently. "What are you thinking of doing, Frank? You can't just pretend you never saw that video, but you also can't confront Kevin directly without knowing more about what you're dealing with." Her practical approach helped focus my scattered thoughts. Action was required, but the wrong action could make everything worse for Kevin and potentially dangerous for me. Information gathering had to come before confrontation. I needed to understand the scope of Kevin's involvement before deciding how to help him escape whatever situation he'd created. The logical first step was visiting Columbus myself, but not to confront Kevin directly. Instead, I could observe his apartment complex, talk to neighbors, maybe even speak with local police about recent incidents in the area.
Reconnaissance before engagement, the same methodical approach I'd always used for complex mechanical problems. Betty seemed to read my thoughts. If you're planning to go to Columbus, don't go alone. Take Jim Patterson with you, or ask me to come along. 2 people are safer than 1, especially if you encounter situations you're not prepared to handle. Jim Patterson lived 3 blocks away and had worked construction before retiring. He was my age, but still strong from decades of physical labor, and his military background had given him experience with situations that required caution and quick thinking. Jim would be a good companion for a reconnaissance mission to Columbus, but involving other people also meant expanding the circle of knowledge about Kevin's potential criminal activities. Every additional person who learned about the security footage increased the chances that information would reach the wrong ears or be shared in ways that could harm Kevin's situation. The moral complexity was staggering. Protecting Kevin from the consequences of his choices might enable him to continue making dangerous decisions, but exposing him to arrest and imprisonment would destroy his life in different ways, especially if he was more victim than perpetrator in whatever criminal enterprise had captured him. Helen would have known what to do. She'd always possessed intuitive wisdom about family relationships and moral dilemmas that escaped my more mechanical approach to problem solving. Her advice would have been invaluable for navigating this situation, but Helen was gone, and I had to make these decisions alone. Betty released my hand and stood up again, pacing toward the kitchen sink, where she stared out at the backyard Helen had loved so much. The autumn garden was dormant now, waiting for spring renewal that Helen would never see. The parallel between seasonal cycles and family relationships wasn't lost on me. Sometimes things had to die completely before new growth could emerge. Maybe Kevin needed to face the full consequences of his choices before he could find his way back to the values Helen and I had tried to instill in him. Maybe protecting him from those consequences would only delay the inevitable reckoning while allowing more damage to accumulate. Or maybe family loyalty required standing by him regardless of his mistakes, offering support and guidance even when his behavior seemed indefensible. The obligations of blood relationships might supersede concerns about enabling bad choices or personal safety risks. The decision crystallized while I stared at my reflection in the bathroom mirror the next morning. Dark circles under bloodshot eyes told the story of a sleepless night spent wrestling with impossible choices. Kevin was my responsibility, whether I liked it or not, and waiting for more information wouldn't protect him if he was already in over his head. Jim Patterson answered his phone on the second ring.
his gravelly voice carrying the alert tone of someone who'd been awake for hours despite the early morning call. "Frank, you sound terrible. What's going on over there?" I explained the situation as briefly as possible while Jim listened without interrupting, a skill he'd developed during his military years when receiving mission briefings under pressure. The security footage, Betty's discoveries about police presence, Kevin's unexplained wealth and lifestyle changes. By the time I finished, Jim was already asking practical questions about timing and logistics. "When do you want to leave for Columbus?" His immediate willingness to help reminded me why we'd remained friends for over 30 years. Jim understood loyalty and didn't waste time questioning whether risky situations were worth the potential consequences when family was involved. "Today," I replied, "the longer we wait, the deeper Kevin might sink into whatever trouble he's already created. If there's still time to pull him out, we need to act now rather than later." Jim agreed to meet at my house within 2 hours, giving us both time to prepare for what might become a multi-day investigation.
I packed an overnight bag with practical clothes and basic tools, unsure what situations we might encounter but wanting to be ready for various contingencies. The drive to Columbus took just over an hour through familiar Ohio countryside that had changed remarkably little during my lifetime. Small farms and rural communities scrawled past my truck windows like scenes from a slower era, offering a stark contrast to the urban problems we were heading toward. Jim rode shotgun, studying maps and making notes about the apartment complex layout Betty had researched. Riverside Gardens turned out to be one of those modern developments designed to look upscale while maintaining affordable rent prices for young professionals. 3-story buildings arranged around a central courtyard with a swimming pool that had been drained for winter. Parking spaces were assigned by apartment number, making it easy to locate Kevin's building even though we'd never visited before. Unit 12B occupied a corner position on the second floor, with windows facing both the parking area and the interior courtyard. From a surveillance perspective, it offered good visibility in multiple directions, while providing residents privacy from casual observation. The tactical advantages weren't lost on Jim, whose military background made him naturally assess defensive positions and escape routes. Kevin's assigned parking space sat empty, but oil stains on the concrete suggested regular vehicle use. The building's exterior showed typical apartment complex wear, nothing that indicated particular prosperity or poverty among the residents. Landscaping was minimal but well-maintained, creating an impression of middle-class respectability that masked whatever activities might be occurring behind closed doors. Jim pointed toward a maintenance shed near the back of the complex. Good place to observe without attracting attention. We can watch Kevin's apartment from there and see who comes and goes without being obvious about it. The shed provided adequate concealment while offering clear sightlines to Kevin's building. We settled in for what might be a long wait, taking turns with binoculars Jim had brought from his hunting gear. The morning passed slowly, with minimal activity beyond residents leaving for work and maintenance crews performing routine tasks. Around noon, a silver sedan pulled into Kevin's parking space, with 2 occupants visible through the windshield. My heart rate spiked as I recognized Kevin's profile in the passenger seat, but the driver remained obscured by sun glare on the glass. They sat in the car for several minutes, apparently having an intense conversation that involved frequent gesturing and what appeared to be arguments based on their body language. Jim lowered his binoculars and looked at me with concern. "That doesn't look like a friendly discussion between roommates. Something's got them worked up about whatever business they're conducting." The driver's door opened first, revealing a woman who matched the description Betty had given me of Rachel Martinez. She was attractive in an expensive way that suggested professional styling rather than natural beauty, with clothing and accessories that reinforced the impression of wealth we'd seen in Kevin's social media posts. Kevin emerged from the passenger side, moving like someone carrying a heavy burden of stress or fear. His shoulders were hunched, his movements quick and nervous as he glanced around the parking lot before following Rachel toward their building entrance. The confident young man I remembered had been replaced by someone who acted like he expected trouble from any direction. They disappeared into the building, leaving Jim and me to speculate about what we'd witnessed.
The conversation in the car had clearly been confrontational, with Rachel appearing to dominate while Kevin seemed defensive or apologetic. Power dynamics in their relationship weren't what I'd expected from Kevin's vague descriptions during our last phone call. Jim adjusted his position behind the maintenance equipment. "Your grandson looks scared, Frank. Not guilty necessarily, but definitely afraid of something or someone."
That could mean he's in over his head, rather than being the mastermind of whatever operation they're running. The possibility offered a glimmer of hope. If Kevin was more victim than perpetrator, then extraction might be possible without him facing serious criminal charges. But it also meant he could be in immediate physical danger if he tried to withdraw from criminal activities without permission from whoever controlled the operation. Less than 30 minutes later, their apartment door opened again and Rachel emerged alone. She moved with purpose across the courtyard toward a different building, disappearing inside what appeared to be another apartment unit. The timing suggested she was conducting business that couldn't wait for extended discussions with Kevin. Jim focused his binoculars on the building Rachel had entered. Unit 28C. "We need to find out who lives there and what connection they have to your grandson's situation. Could be where the real power lies in whatever organization has recruited Kevin." The afternoon brought additional visitors to various apartments throughout the complex, but several individuals caught our attention due to their expensive vehicles and brief visit durations. Business meetings rather than social calls, with participants who dressed and moved like people comfortable with money and authority. One visitor particularly stood out due to his size and the deference other people showed him. A man in his 50s with the build of someone who'd stayed in shape through physical work rather than gym memberships. His presence seemed to change the atmosphere around the complex, with other residents giving him wide berth and avoiding eye contact. When he knocked on Kevin's door, the response was immediate. Kevin appeared quickly, his body language showing the same nervous energy we'd observed earlier. The conversation on Kevin's doorstep was brief but intense, with the older man doing most of the talking while Kevin nodded repeatedly like someone receiving orders rather than having a discussion. Jim whispered urgent observations. "That's not Kevin's peer or business partner. That's someone giving instructions to a subordinate who can't afford to refuse compliance. Your grandson is definitely working for someone else rather than running his own operation." The power structure was becoming clearer. Kevin was a low-level participant in some larger criminal enterprise, valuable for his technical skills but expendable if he became a liability or tried to leave without permission. The expensive lifestyle was payment for services rendered, but it came with obligations that could be enforced through intimidation or violence. After the older man left, Kevin remained on his doorstep for several minutes, staring toward the parking lot with an expression that looked like despair mixed with resignation. He understood his situation better than anyone, trapped between criminal obligations and family values that made him uncomfortable with whatever role he'd accepted. Rachel returned from her business meeting as Kevin was going back inside, and their reunion involved another heated discussion that carried enough volume for us to hear angry voices without making out specific words. Their relationship was clearly strained by whatever pressures they were facing, with blame and accusations flowing in both directions. Jim checked his watch and made notes about the timing of various visits and meetings we'd observed. "This looks like a regular business operation with scheduled meetings and hierarchical structure. Kevin's involved in something organized and ongoing rather than a single criminal incident that got out of hand." The implications were sobering. Single mistakes could be explained, forgiven, overcome with proper support and guidance, but ongoing criminal enterprises required consistent participation in activities that would gradually corrupt Kevin's moral foundation while making it increasingly difficult to return to legitimate life. As evening approached, more visitors arrived at different apartments throughout the complex, but several individuals caught our attention due to their expensive vehicles and brief visit durations. Business meetings rather than social calls, with participants who dressed and moved like people comfortable with money and authority. The pattern suggested Riverside Gardens might be serving as a base of operations for criminal activities that involved multiple residents working together under central coordination. Kevin's apartment was just one component in a larger network that would be difficult to escape without cooperation from law enforcement. The security footage Betty had shown me took on new significance in this context. Kevin wasn't just disposing of evidence from a single incident, but participating in regular activities that required cleaning up traces of ongoing criminal operations.
The coordination with Rachel and the heavy object they'd moved were part of routine business rather than emergency damage control. Jim gathered his equipment as darkness began falling across the complex. "We need to get closer tonight, Frank. See if we can hear what's being discussed in Kevin's apartment or get a better look at whatever materials they're handling. But we also need to be ready to call police if we witness active criminal behavior." The prospect of observing Kevin commit crimes in real time made my stomach churn with dread and anticipation. Evidence gathering was necessary to understand his situation, but watching my grandson break laws would confirm fears I'd been trying to suppress since Betty first showed me that security video. We relocated to a position closer to Kevin's building as residents settled in for the evening and exterior lighting created pockets of shadow that would conceal our movement. The apartment windows glowed warmly from interior lights, creating the illusion of domestic tranquility that masked whatever illegal activities were being conducted inside those walls. Through Kevin's partially open window, voices carried across the night air with enough clarity to distinguish individual speakers. Rachel's voice dominated most conversations, giving instructions and asking questions that sounded like business planning rather than casual relationship discussions. Kevin's responses were shorter, more deferential, suggesting he followed her lead in most decision-making processes. The dynamics reinforced Jim's earlier assessment that Kevin was working as a subordinate rather than an equal partner. Rachel appeared to have connections and authority that made her valuable to the criminal organization, while Kevin provided technical skills that supported their operations without giving him significant influence over strategy or direction. Around 10 o'clock, their conversation shifted toward topics that made the criminal nature of their activities unmistakably clear. References to delivery schedules, payment distributions, and security precautions painted a picture of ongoing illegal business that required careful coordination and risk management. Jim grabbed my arm and pointed toward the parking lot where another expensive vehicle was arriving with multiple occupants. The same older man from earlier emerged along with two companions who carried themselves like professional security personnel or enforcers. This was no longer reconnaissance. We were witnessing active criminal operations that would require police intervention to protect Kevin from consequences he might not survive if he tried to extract himself without professional help. The older man's arrival changed everything about our surveillance operation. Jim immediately pulled out his phone and started recording video while I focused binoculars on the group approaching Kevin's building. 3 men moved with the kind of coordinated precision that spoke of military or law enforcement backgrounds, but their expensive clothing and late-night timing suggested different allegiances entirely. Kevin's apartment door opened before they reached it, indicating he'd been watching for their arrival. The brief conversation on his doorstep carried enough tension to be visible even from our concealed position behind the maintenance equipment. Kevin's body language screamed submission and fear, while the older man gestured with casual authority that made my blood run cold. Within minutes, they disappeared inside Kevin's apartment, leaving Jim and me to debate our rapidly shrinking options. Calling police would trigger an immediate response that might save Kevin from whatever was happening upstairs, but it would also guarantee his arrest and prosecution for whatever criminal activities we'd already witnessed. Not calling police might mean Kevin would face consequences from his criminal associates that could be far worse than anything the legal system would impose. Jim whispered urgently while keeping his phone camera trained on Kevin's windows. "Frank, we're witnessing active criminal conspiracy right now. Whatever your grandson got himself involved in, it's escalating tonight beyond anything he's probably prepared to handle." Through Kevin's partially open windows, voices carried across the night air with enough clarity to make out occasional words and phrases. Terms like payment schedules, territory assignments, and security protocols painted an unmistakable picture of organized criminal operations that extended far beyond the apartment complex we'd been observing. The conversation inside grew heated around midnight, with Rachel's voice rising to levels that suggested serious disagreement with whatever the older man was proposing. Kevin's attempts to mediate between them were cut short by sharp commands that reduced him to nervous silence. The power dynamics couldn't have been clearer. Kevin was expendable labor whose opinions carried no weight in strategic decisions. A door slammed inside the apartment, followed by the sound of someone leaving through what must have been a back exit. Moments later, one of the younger men who'd arrived with the older man appeared in the parking lot, walking quickly toward their vehicle with something tucked under his jacket that created an ominous bulge. Jim grabbed my arm with enough force to leave bruises. That looked like a weapon, Frank. This situation just escalated from white-collar crime to potential violence. We need to call this in right now before someone gets hurt. The weight of decision pressed down on me like a physical force. Kevin was my grandson, the little boy I'd taught to change spark plugs and tie fishing knots. But he was also an adult who'd made choices that led him into criminal activities with dangerous people. My obligation to protect him had to be balanced against the possibility that intervention might make his situation worse rather than better. Before I could make the call, Kevin's apartment door opened again and he emerged onto the second-floor walkway. Even from our distance, his distress was obvious in every movement as he paced back and forth outside his own door like a caged animal. The older man appeared behind him, and their conversation continued with enough volume that individual words began reaching us across the courtyard. "You don't have choices anymore, Kevin." The older man's voice carried the kind of quiet menace that was more terrifying than shouting. "You signed up for this operation when you accepted our money and benefits. Walking away isn't an option we offer to employees who know our business model." Kevin's response was too quiet to make out clearly, but his body language suggested pleading rather than argument. His hands moved in gestures that looked like appeals for understanding or mercy, while the older man remained statue still with the confidence of someone accustomed to absolute compliance with his directives. The conversation ended abruptly when the older man turned his back on Kevin and walked toward the stairwell. Kevin stood alone on the walkway for several minutes, staring toward the parking lot with an expression that looked like despair mixed with resignation. When he finally went back inside his apartment, he moved like someone who'd just received a death sentence. Jim had continued recording throughout the exchange, and now he played back portions with the volume adjusted to capture every audible word. The implications were clear and terrifying. Kevin wasn't just involved in criminal activities. He was trapped by people who used violence to enforce compliance with their business operations.
The older man and his companions left the complex around 1 in the morning, but their departure didn't signal the end of the evening's activities. Rachel emerged from Kevin's apartment shortly afterward and walked quickly toward the building where we'd seen her conduct business earlier. Her movement suggested urgency that made me wonder if Kevin's situation had created problems for other aspects of their criminal operations. Jim checked his watch and made notes about timing and participants in what had become a detailed surveillance log. "We've got enough evidence to trigger a major investigation, Frank. Video recordings, license plate numbers, clear audio of criminal conspiracy discussions. The question is whether turning this over to police will help Kevin or destroy him completely." The moral complexity was staggering. Kevin was obviously in serious danger from criminal associates who didn't tolerate defection or unreliability, but he was also guilty of crimes that would result in imprisonment if law enforcement became involved. Neither option offered a clear path toward protecting him while preserving his future prospects. Around 2 in the morning, Rachel returned from her business meeting with news that prompted another heated discussion in Kevin's apartment. Their voices carried enough emotional intensity to wake neighbors, who began turning on lights and peering through curtains at the disturbance. The criminal organization's operational security was breaking down due to stress and poor decision-making under pressure. The argument between Kevin and Rachel escalated until something crashed inside their apartment, possibly furniture being overturned during a physical confrontation. Kevin's voice rose to levels we could hear clearly, and his words made my heart sink toward my shoes. "I never wanted any of this, Rachel. I just needed money to pay off my student loans and maybe afford a decent apartment. You promised it would be simple computer work, nothing dangerous or illegal that could hurt anyone else." Rachel's response carried venom that made me glad we were observing from a safe distance. "You're in this as deep as anyone else, Kevin.
The people we work for don't care about your financial motivations or moral reservations. They care about results and loyalty, and you've become unreliable in both areas. The conversation that followed revealed details about Kevin's role in their criminal operations that made his situation even more desperate. His technical skills had been used to facilitate identity theft, financial fraud, and money laundering activities that generated significant revenue for the criminal organization. He wasn't just a peripheral participant, but a crucial component in their operational structure. Even if Kevin wanted to withdraw from their activities, his knowledge of their methods and participants made him a permanent security risk that couldn't be addressed through simple termination of employment. People who knew too much about criminal operations were typically eliminated rather than released to potentially cooperate with law enforcement. Jim pointed toward the parking lot where another vehicle was arriving with multiple occupants. More business associates arriving for what was apparently becoming a crisis management meeting. The criminal organization was responding to whatever instability Kevin's behavior had introduced into their operations. This time, the visitors didn't bother with discreet entry procedures. They walked directly to Kevin's apartment and entered without knocking, suggesting they had keys or Kevin had been instructed to leave the door unlocked. The apartment filled with voices as at least 6 people gathered for discussions that couldn't be postponed until more convenient hours. Through the windows, we could see figures moving around Kevin's living room in what appeared to be a formal meeting arrangement. Kevin and Rachel sat together on what must have been their couch, while the other participants arranged themselves in chairs that suggested hierarchy and authority relationships.
The meeting lasted over an hour, with different speakers taking turns addressing the group while Kevin and Rachel listened in obvious discomfort. Occasional phrases reached us across the courtyard, references to damage control, security protocols, and personnel reassignments that painted a picture of criminal operations being restructured to address problems Kevin had created. When the meeting finally ended, the other participants left quickly while Kevin and Rachel remained behind for what appeared to be final instructions or warnings. Their body language suggested they understood the seriousness of their situation and the limited options available for resolution. Jim had filled multiple memory cards with video recordings and audio segments that would provide law enforcement with unprecedented insight into organized criminal operations. But turning over this evidence would inevitably result in Kevin's arrest and prosecution as a key participant rather than an unwilling victim. The sun was beginning to rise over the apartment complex when the last visitors departed, leaving Kevin and Rachel alone to contemplate whatever ultimatum they'd received from their criminal associates. Through the windows, we could see them packing belongings into suitcases with the urgent efficiency of people preparing to flee. Jim gathered his surveillance equipment while keeping one eye on Kevin's apartment windows. "They're running, Frank. Whatever instructions they received last night, Kevin and Rachel have decided their only option is to disappear rather than comply with their organization's demands." The realization hit me like a physical blow. Kevin was about to become a fugitive from both criminal associates and law enforcement, with no safe haven available in either direction. Running would only delay inevitable consequences while making his situation worse through additional charges related to flight from prosecution. My phone felt heavy in my hands as I stared at the keypad that could connect me to emergency services. One call would bring police to the apartment complex within minutes, preventing Kevin's flight while ensuring his arrest on multiple criminal charges. Not making the call would allow him to flee toward an uncertain future as a wanted man with dangerous enemies pursuing him. The decision couldn't be postponed any longer. Kevin was loading the last of his belongings into Rachel's vehicle, and they would be gone within minutes unless I acted immediately. Whatever choice I made would determine whether my grandson faced justice through the legal system or justice through criminal associates who didn't offer appeals processes or second chances. I dialed 911 with trembling fingers while Kevin and Rachel carried their suitcases toward the parking lot, knowing that my next words would change his life forever. 911, what's your emergency? The dispatcher's calm professionalism contrasted sharply with the chaos unfolding in Kevin's parking lot as he and Rachel loaded their final belongings into her vehicle.
This is Frank Thompson. I'm at Riverside Gardens apartment complex on Route 33 in Columbus. I've been conducting surveillance on criminal activities involving my grandson, Kevin Thompson, in Unit 12B. Multiple participants in organized crime operations, and they're attempting to flee the scene right now. Sir, are you in immediate danger? Do you need medical assistance? No immediate danger to myself, but my grandson is involved with people who've been making threats of violence. I have video evidence of criminal conspiracy meetings and discussions about territory assignments and payment schedules. They're loading vehicles to run right now. Officers are being dispatched to your location. Please stay on the line and maintain visual contact with the subjects if possible. Through my binoculars, I watched Kevin throw the last suitcase into Rachel's trunk with desperate efficiency. His movements carried the frantic energy of someone who understood that freedom measured in minutes rather than hours. Rachel was already behind the wheel with the engine running, her face showing the same desperate calculation. Jim continued recording everything while providing commentary for his video log. Male and female subjects loading silver sedan, Ohio license plate, Charlie Delta 7492. Male appears to be early 20s, female mid-20s, both showing signs of extreme stress and urgency in their movements. The dispatcher requested additional details about the criminal activities we'd witnessed, and I found myself recounting hours of surveillance in rapid summary. Drug distribution network, financial fraud operations, identity theft schemes, all coordinated through multiple apartment units with hierarchical command structure. Kevin's role as technical support specialist for computer-based criminal activities. Kevin slammed the trunk closed and ran around to the passenger side just as police sirens became audible in the distance. His face went white when he heard the approaching law enforcement response, and he spent precious seconds looking around the parking lot as if searching for alternative escape routes. Rachel gunned the engine and pulled out of the parking space with enough speed to leave rubber marks on the asphalt. But their exit route took them directly toward the complex entrance, where the first police cruiser was already turning into the driveway with emergency lights flashing. The sedan stopped abruptly as Rachel realized their path was blocked by law enforcement vehicles arriving from multiple directions. Kevin's door opened immediately, and he emerged with his hands raised in surrender, understanding that resistance would only make their situation worse. Rachel took longer to comply, sitting behind the wheel with her hands gripping the steering wheel until officers approached with weapons drawn. Jim and I remained in our concealed position while police secured the scene and placed both Kevin and Rachel in custody. The professional efficiency of the arrest operation suggested law enforcement had been investigating this criminal organization longer than we'd realized, possibly using our emergency call as the trigger to execute warrants they'd already prepared. Within 30 minutes, the apartment complex filled with detectives, forensic specialists, and federal agents whose presence indicated the scope of criminal activities extended beyond local jurisdiction. Search warrants were executed on multiple apartment units simultaneously, suggesting our surveillance had captured only a small portion of a much larger criminal enterprise. Detective Maria Santos interviewed Jim and me separately, reviewing our video evidence and surveillance logs with the thoroughness of someone building a comprehensive prosecution case. Our recordings provided unprecedented documentation of criminal conspiracy meetings and organizational hierarchy that would be invaluable for dismantling the entire network. "Mr. Thompson," Detective Santos said after reviewing our materials, "your grandson was definitely involved in serious criminal activities, but the evidence suggests he was operating under duress rather than as a willing participant. His technical skills made him valuable to their operations, but he appears to have been manipulated and threatened into compliance." The assessment offered a glimmer of hope that Kevin might be treated as a victim rather than a perpetrator, depending on his willingness to cooperate with law enforcement investigations. Federal prosecutors would ultimately determine whether his participation warranted criminal charges or qualified him for witness protection programs. Over the following weeks, the investigation revealed the full extent of the criminal organization Kevin had become entangled with. Rachel Martinez was identified as a mid-level coordinator in a multi-state identity theft and financial fraud network that had generated millions of dollars through sophisticated computer-based schemes. Kevin's role had indeed been primarily technical, developing software tools and maintaining computer systems that facilitated the criminal operations.
His programming skills had made him indispensable to their business model,
but his moral reservations had created reliability problems that eventually led to the threats we'd witnessed during our surveillance. The federal prosecutor assigned to Kevin's case contacted me directly to discuss his cooperation agreement and potential sentencing recommendations. Kevin had provided detailed information about the criminal organization's methods, participants, and financial structure that enabled law enforcement to arrest over 40 individuals across 6 states. Mr. Thompson, Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Walsh, explained during our meeting, Kevin's cooperation has been exemplary. He's accepted responsibility for his actions while providing crucial assistance in dismantling a criminal network that was victimizing thousands of innocent people through identity theft and financial fraud. The sentencing hearing took place on a gray November morning that reminded me of the day Helen had passed away 2 years earlier. Kevin appeared in federal court wearing a suit I'd never seen before, looking older and more mature than the frightened young man we'd observed fleeing his apartment complex. When the judge asked if he had anything to say before sentencing, Kevin turned toward the gallery where I sat with Jim and Betty, who had insisted on attending to show support for our family. Your Honor, Kevin's voice carried steady resolve that reminded me of the boy who'd once been determined to rebuild an entire engine because he wanted to understand how every component functioned. I made terrible choices that hurt innocent people and disappointed my family. I accept full responsibility for my actions and am grateful for the opportunity to make amends through cooperation with law enforcement. The judge sentenced Kevin to 18 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation and community service requirements that would allow him to use his technical skills for legitimate purposes. The sentence was far more lenient than what he could have faced without the cooperation agreement. Rachel Martinez received a much harsher sentence due to her leadership role and refusal to cooperate with investigators. 8 years in federal prison with no possibility of early parole, a consequence that served as a reminder of how much worse Kevin's situation could have become if we hadn't intervened when we did. Kevin served his sentence at a minimum security facility in southern Ohio, close enough for regular visits that gradually rebuilt our relationship through honest conversations about choices, consequences, and family obligations. The experience had fundamentally changed him in ways that restored my faith in the values Helen and I had tried to instill during his childhood. Upon his release, Kevin moved back to Millbrook and accepted a position with a local computer repair business that specialized in helping elderly residents navigate modern technology. The work paid modestly compared to his criminal earnings, but it provided legitimate income and opportunities to use his skills for constructive purposes. We rebuilt Helen's old garden together during his first spring back home, working side by side in soil that had been dormant since her death. The physical labor and shared purpose created space for conversations about the future rather than dwelling on past mistakes. Betty Chen continued to be a valuable friend and neighbor whose intervention had ultimately saved Kevin from consequences that could have destroyed his life entirely. Her willingness to share uncomfortable truths about family members demonstrated the kind of courage that prevents tragedies through early intervention. 3 years later, Kevin married a teacher from the local high school and started a legitimate computer consulting business that served small businesses throughout southern Ohio. Their wedding reception was held in our backyard, with tables arranged around Helen's restored garden under lights Jim had helped me string through the old oak trees.
During his wedding toast, Kevin thanked me for making the difficult decision to call law enforcement when he couldn't find the courage to extract himself from criminal activities. Sometimes family love requires hard choices that feel like betrayal, but ultimately provide salvation for people who've lost their way. The experience taught me that protection sometimes comes through consequences rather than rescue, and that real love requires the strength to do what's right rather than what feels comfortable. Kevin had needed justice more than he'd needed protection from accountability for his choices. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.